Welcome to Growing and Aging Sex Positive, or GASP.
Get ready to grow with us as we discuss all things sex and sexuality related.
I'm Nina.
And I'm Cari. Today, we will be talking about relationships and relationship styles, and specifically attachment theory.
Also, we want to hear from you. What's on your mind? What questions or thoughts do you have about sex and sexuality? We will be sharing questions and replies in a future episode. Write to us at gaspod@gmail.com or gaspod@gmail.com.
First, we want to thank our sponsor, Oak Park Our Whole Lives. Oak Park OWL has classes for kids in 1st, 5th, and 8th grade in the Greater West Side of Chicagoland area. Classes start in September and January each year. For more information, please go to their website at www.opowl.org.
Now let's get into it.
So hi folks, welcome to another episode of GASP. Today, Nina and I are going to be talking about attachment theory.
So much in there.
So much in there. As I was researching attachment theory and how it applies to adult relationships and possibly sexuality, I was sort of flabbergasted by how much history there is to attachment theory and just all the ways that it plays out in humanity, not just sexuality. So it's a good subject.
Could we start with why are we talking about attachment in a sex podcast?
Great question, Nina. So attachment theory is thought to apply to all kinds of relationships that humans have. The attachment we're talking about is the attachment emotionally between two people. And so I think that heavily applies to sexuality because a lot of the time sexuality is relational. I don't know if I want to say always. I don't like to be definitive, but I would say most of the time sexuality has a relational component, and how you attach to other humans definitely is part of your sexuality. Any other thoughts you have about why attachment theory matters for sexuality?
It can be really intense. What you said just now made me wonder, can we apply attachment theory to our relationships with ourselves? I don't even know.
That was good. I don't know the answer to that. That could be a whole own episode.
Well, always more questions coming up. That's what education is about, right? Raising more questions.
I love that. And so you ask about, can we apply it to ourselves? So I guess I'll back up and talk a little bit about very cliff notes. You know, this is not going to be a Psychology 101 class, but very cliff notes about what attachment theory is. So it's kind of a multidisciplinary thing, but most of us are familiar with attachment theory in the field of psychology. And it does have a little bit of a disclaimer, dark background. It was primarily being studied kind of beginning of the 20th century through mid-20th century. That was really talking about infants who were abandoned by their maternal figure or their caregiver, and what their responses to that abandonment was. And that's kind of deep. So in the 1950s, a psychologist, a psychoanalyst, develops attachment theory. His name was John Bowlby, and he was really emphasizing that bond between infants and their caregivers. And specifically, he noticed that there were patterns in how infants responded to a frightening situation. So their caregiver leaving them in an unfamiliar environment in a room. And when he was watching the infants, they were all upset when the caregiver left. That's what you expect from an infant when they're, quote, abandoned or left by their caregiver. But when the primary caregiver returned, it's really the response of the infant that he was looking at. So is the infant soothed by the caregiver immediately and then goes back to being connected with the caregiver and behaving, quote, normally? Do they largely ignore or freeze out the caregiver and carry on with playing or whatever they were doing in a kind of punishing or cold way to their caregiver? Or are they not able to be soothed? Or then there's a category of kids that are swing between the two of them. So maybe like really anxious, but then also maybe coldly punishing the caregiver. So they bucketed the infants into those early attachment styles. And we'll talk more about what those attachment styles are called later. And then in the 1960s and 1970s, they did more rigorous studies in something you might be familiar with called the Strange situation, which is that specific experiment where they put infants and mothers in a room. Mom leaves the room, and it's not infants, it's actually 1-year-olds. So they have the ability to move around a room, play with blocks, whatever. And she comes up with those words, secure, anxious, and avoidant, which we'll talk about later.
Oh, so who is she here? Important part of the story. Yeah.
Leave it to me to leave out the female psychologist who expanded on things. Her name was Mary Ainsworth. So she was doing this research in the 1960s and 70s. And then as time has gone on, this has become a well-studied theory in psychology that's been applied to adult relationships and not just relationships between an infant and their caregiver. And there's also been more research that's more inclusive, so it's not just moms and infants, it's any primary caregiver, any caregiver that an infant or young person would be attached to emotionally.
Can I just say, I find it so fascinating and important. We were talking just before recording about how significant that is, that an infant's relationship with a parent or caregiver, that we can analyze that, or that we can make sense of it in the same way that we can make sense of adult relationships.
Yeah, it's pretty profound.
With each other.
I find that pretty profound.
To me, that suggests that it's saying something really deep and important about what it means to connect with another person, or maybe have a relationship with another person.
Yeah.
As such.
For sure. And then you're just jogging my memory, and we'll talk maybe a little bit more about the terminology in a moment. But anyone who's just looked at any of the pop psychology, read an article, read a book, heard a therapist talk about this, heard about attachment style parenting or attachment parenting, you might know some of these words. So, for example, secure, what security really means, right? What does anxiety mean? So for an infant, it's anxiety because, or abandonment, such a big scary word, that their caregiver leaves, and is the caregiver going to come back? And all those words to me feel very primal. It has a life and death component. Am I secure? Meaning, is this person who I depend on for food and safety coming back to me? And I think what's fascinating to me is that as they keep studying this, it tends to be replicated across all stages of human development, meaning those attachment styles that we talked about in the 80s when they got to studying them for romantic partners, the same general clusters of responses to perceived rejection or abandonment come up with romantic partners. That's so profound. And it's about survival, right? It's deep, it's primal stuff.
Yeah, and because we might think that they're very different types of relationships, that there's a lot of inequality and dependence in the case of infants or toddlers, where they depend on their caregivers in a way that we might expect two adults not to have a similar kind of asymmetry or dependence. But then we're not. We do have a kind of dependence and a kind of need. And do you know if this applies beyond romantic relationships to friendships or other types of connection?
So that's a phenomenal question. I did see some studies and some people who are studying both the newer areas that are not just either child and caregiver or romantic partnerships, but are also studying other social relationships. And then there's also some super interesting stuff about internal experiences, how consistent is a person's internal experience of their attachment style, and does that change with outside stressors, etc. So I don't have the answer to that, but I think there is really interesting work being done. And I'll just share, in prep for this podcast, I found a little online quiz by a researcher I think at Illinois State University, who is collecting data and then also doing like a fun quiz that spits out your attachment style in a graph. And he has it broken down: maternal attachment, paternal attachment, so how attached I am and how my attachment style is with my mother, my father, in romantic relationships, in friendships, and then globally. And I won't share my results with everyone. That's for a therapy session. But not only was it shockingly accurate, but all of my attachment styles are radically different in those realms.
Wow.
Which tracks for how I feel about my own internal experience of the world. So I think
that was a good quiz.
Yeah. Did you take it as well?
Yes. And that's what prompted me to think about friendship as well as trying to be aware of asexual relationships.
Yeah. And I guess just to honor that, I often, when I read the first kind of research that's really heavily focused on mom, infant, very gendered, and then also when I hear partnered or romantic, yes, we should honor that there are many people who don't plan to be partnered, are not interested in partnering, and they still have attachment styles and they still connect with other people in whatever way
of course
works for them. So that's a good call out. So maybe we should share with our listeners what the types of attachment styles are. So this can be a little confusing, because if you've spent any time on social media or you're in the world of dating or you've picked up a self-help book about relationships, a lot of people will talk about attachment styles and they have a lot of different names. So I'm just going to share the ones that work for me. Feel free to jump in, Nina, if you have other ones, because I know you've read a couple books. But there's a lot of different terminology that people can use. None of it's right or wrong. It's just whatever words you like. So the gold star attachment style that we'll say is, quote, ideal, and by ideal, psychologists would say healthy, is a secure attachment style. So that means you're comfortable with both the intimacy of connecting with another person, and you're also comfortable in your own independence. So you have balance in your responses to other people and in relation to others. There's anxious. Sometimes that's called preoccupied. But that means that you feel a lot of internal anxiety and you're seeking closeness and reassurance, and that underlying fear of abandonment is pretty profound for you. And you've got an awareness of it that makes you act to reach out to the other person for reassurance. And then avoidant would mean that, as implied, you avoid that vulnerability and intimacy and connection. Some people will say that they value their independence and avoid closeness, but it is important to point out that with avoidant attachment style, there is still a deep subconscious fear of abandonment. So there's still an anxiety response, but the way that comes out is by avoiding the connection and the intimacy.
Kind of, I'm not going to let you abandon me because I'll abandon you first.
Yeah, I'm going to be ambivalent about this because if I'm in too deep, then it's really bad. But there still is psychological anxiety that's happening. Nobody's gets out unscathed, right? And then the last one is the disorganized attachment style, which some of these definitions are pretty brutal. I'll share with our listeners just this. I personally have a disorganized attachment style for most romantic relationships, and some of the definitions are pretty brutal and a tough pill to swallow because they make you sound a little bit unbalanced. They lack a clear attachment strategy and have a lot of conflicting behaviors. So a lot of push-pull.
Really makes it sound like you need a strategy, which is really not what the theory would suggest. I would think that if this is something that is building in you from infancy, strategy seems like a really inappropriate term for that.
Yeah. I love that you pointed that out. And also some of these are my words. So that's an interesting choice of words that I picked there. So that's a therapy session right there for me, Nina. Thank you. I love what you just said. And I'd like to pause on it and expand on it. So you just talked about these develop really early in life, probably before we have any control over our relationships or even our survival, really, and whether our needs are being met and how people respond to us, and probably before we were conscious of those connections and emotions. So I think it is important, if you are in the pop psychology or dating sphere or self-help sphere, some of the language is really triggering and puts a lot of blame on people's behavior. I would speak from personal experience that I don't think that most of your attachment style or behavior is conscious or clear. And sometimes the way it influences your behavior is a bit mysterious and usually takes some help, some external help to get clarity on.
A lot of reflection on yourself, as well as the willingness to be honest with yourself is already hard to do for so many people.
For sure.
That pop psych realm, I just want to acknowledge too, because this is a whole huge body of work and has a lot of complexity. And pop psychology, while it has a lot of value in speaking to people and can help us, these categories can help us understand ourselves better, it's important not to overgeneralize.
For sure. And also sometimes, again, and I'll speak from personal experience, sometimes if you're chewing on something or struggling with something or trying to learn something more about yourself, you can inadvertently end up down a TikTok rabbit hole where you've got pop psychologists. It's the same thing on Instagram, whatever your pick your poison on social media, where you get these really nice sound bites from people that may or may not be credentialed. You get a little sound bite and it makes something sound super neat and tidy, and it'll summarize the problem and cannot give you a full picture. And so I do think it's important to say, yeah, those are educational and can be a great place to start. But I don't think most people wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to be avoidant today and I'm going to approach my relationships with a cold distance because I'm deeply afraid of intimacy. It doesn't work that way.
And if you do that, you're doing it wrong.
Yeah, and you're probably not avoidant. There's probably something else happening that you have that level of awareness.
As with any categories or boxes that we try to put people in, if it helps, and if it doesn't, let it go.
Right? I love that take what you need and leave the rest.
Yeah
Within that, chatting about attachment styles, one of the most interesting things that I have found, particularly when talking about adult romantic or sexual relationships, is this idea that certain pairings of attachment styles can be more common than others and can show up as patterns as you relate to multiple people or in different relationships throughout your lifetime. And I know a lot of people who are aware that they have this pattern, but don't really see it in its full scope. And that's the kind of push-pull dynamic that you get when somebody who's very anxiously leaning combos with somebody who's avoidantly leaning. Have you read anything about that or heard anything about that dynamic?
So I have, and I'll just shout out this book that came out not too long ago called Secure Love by Julie Menano. I really recommend it. That helped me get into these different categories of attachment theory in a clearer way. And part of what I like about the book is that she describes these categories in detail, but then she also takes it to the next step of how can we work to be within a relationship to become more secure. And a lot of the book is about identifying conflict patterns and repair and how to repair those patterns. And so one thing she points out is that when you pair an anxious person with another anxious person, that relationship often can burn out really quickly. And similarly, when an avoidant type or someone with avoidant tendencies pairs with another person with avoidant tendencies, it's also less likely to be long term, right? They're going to walk away from each other in consistency with their attachment styles.
Yeah, for sure.
So then an anxious avoidant pairing is actually a more, if you will, stable kind of pairing. So then she spends more time talking about this. And according to her, this is the most frequent or typical.
I've read that too. That's the most common pairing. I don't know how we would assess that globally, but I believe that. So I guess I'll just describe a little bit about what that anxious avoidant combo can look like, but I'd love for you to add more nuance because it sounds like this book has some great insight.
You know what? Can I add a disclaimer, first of all, that I think might be relevant here? That she starts out the book by saying this is not appropriate. This is a non-starter for abusive relationships.
Yes. I'm air snapping for that.
So if you recognize abuse happening in the relationships, then trying to work on identifying these conflict patterns is just really not going to get you anywhere, and it might even be more problematic. So that's something to evaluate before you get into this.
I love that call out, Nina, and I also love expanding that even further in that any conflict or relationship pattern that you're interested in working on in yourself can only be worked on in yourself, and you only have control of yourself. And looking at an abusive person or a person struggling with behaviors that are harmful to you is not a moment for you to dig deep into figuring out why. Right? Keep yourself safe first and foremost, because
that's right. That's right.
And I guess that for me is important to point out, because I know I've referenced a couple times the pop psychology, but often we find ourselves researching these things when we're struggling with something that's really painful.
Yeah.
And because some of this stuff is ingrained from childhood, it can be really easy to get down a path of self-blame or trying to manage difficult patterns that are actually really harming you. So I like that call out. But in a non-abusive dynamic with two people that are partnered and one leans more anxious and one leans more avoidant, I think about it in my head like magnets. And what I mean by that is that you have the sides of the magnet that are attracted to each other and go right together. So there's a part, like you mentioned in slightly different terminology, of there's some level of like synergy and balance between someone who tends to respond to conflict and attach with avoidance and someone who's anxious, because one person is really emoting and is seeking out reassurance while the other kind of pulls away. So that dynamic works. The two go together. But the flip side is when it becomes really extreme, the other side of the magnets is two people really moving away from each other and are not authentically connecting. So often that's described as like a push-pull dynamic where the avoidant partner is overwhelmed by an anxious partner's bid for reassurance from them. Those needs feel like too much and they pull away. And then the anxious partner doubles down and seeks further reassurance, and the avoidant partner pulls away further. And it's this kind of cyclical pattern. And I think it's worth pointing out that it's hard on both parties and that it creates conflict for both parties. And usually when it's happening to people, it doesn't feel super great.
Oh, yeah. And to say that it's stable does not mean to say that it's healthy. That it's to say that those patterns of stuff coming up for one or both of you can continue to cycle through them for a long time. Yeah.
And I guess it's important to say that the ultimate goal is that both partners would be able to move towards security and feel okay both independently and in handling conflict and anxiety in their partner. If anyone has been watching the show, there's a show called Couples Theory or Couples Therapy. And the psychoanalyst in that show said something that was so profound to me about relating. And she's talking about it in romantic partnerships, but I really love it, is that the ultimate secure conflict resolution in a relationship, because we're never going to have no conflict. People are always going to have insecurities, external conflict, is that the conflict and the problem is like a ball that you're tossing back and forth between you and the other person. And when it's your turn, you catch the ball and you hold it and you examine it and you take something away from it or you add to it, which would be the perspective, right? You're listening, you're absorbing, offering perspective, and then you toss it back to the other partner. The ball, the problem doesn't necessarily go away, the anxiety doesn't diminish, but it's a shared load and it's going back and forth with perspective. And I love that. I think that's a great visual. We talked a little bit about who might be attracted to who. And I guess I have a broader question for you, and I'm interested in your perspective. How much do you think this directly relates to people's sexuality? Was there any kind of discussion of that in the book, or was it all really at the relationship conflict?
It was, so that's a great question, and it's something that I have been wondering about. It doesn't, I might have missed something in the book, but I didn't see anything directly relating to sexual behavior or dynamics. And this book is assuming long-term relationships that are we're assuming that we're going to extend them somehow, or that we're going to make them last longer by learning about how our conflict patterns and to repair them. And in fact, the subtitle is called Secure Love: Create a Relationship That Lasts a Lifetime. So that really is the focus.
It's interesting because in the sort of realm of the world that I'm living in and the media that I'm consuming, attachment styles are often talked about in dating. So in people who are not partnered but would ideally like to be partnered, and I am making an assumption, but typically the content is geared towards people who are looking for a committed romantic partnership and are dating with that as the goal, and often are talking about the challenges of running into people with incompatible attachment styles. So this is the picture that's often painted in like a TikTok video, and that would be that avoidants are painted as monstrously bordering on abusive and harmful people, typically masculine. I'm generalizing, but this is the pop psych, typically masculine, and there's an undertone that they want physical intimacy, but they are not good at emotional intimacy, and that avoidance will snag an anxious girl, woman, femme person, and do everything to make her anxiety worse and extract something from her, which is usually like the undercurrent is get sex from them and then vanish, avoid them by literally ghosting them or blocking them. That's the most common scenario that gets painted, and often when advice is being given by dating gurus, it's to those women. It's like how to avoid getting an avoidant, which I've been finding really fascinating, right?
Yeah.
And there is a direct tie there to how a presumption being made, and I don't know that it's actually valid or scientifically studied, that people who are avoidant and anxious have sex for different reasons. So I find that a fascinating idea.
So that's so much, right? It's so interesting. There's a desire to game the system, right? And how can you identify as quickly as possible whether this person is suitable for you or not? And so I cannot totally understand that this pop psychology way of categorizing people will be really appealing in that way. And as you referred, there's definitely this heterosexual set of assumptions working underneath that. Although, as we have been talking, I think it's way more powerful than that.
I think it is way more powerful than that. And I do find it interesting how we have, I'm not sure if your book did this, but I definitely, in pop psychology and social media, there's definitely a gendering, like a pretty strong idea and picture of avoidance as masculine. And I just find it very interesting that's the narrative or the cultural narrative, because I didn't see that in the research. I saw that people that are studied group pretty, and I didn't exhaustively research attachment styles by gender, but I just wonder how much of that is socialized, and is there any trend with gender and sexuality?
In the book, it definitely did say most men or most avoidant people with avoidant styles are men, but not all. And most people with anxious styles tend to be women, but she was really careful about not universalizing that. She is a marriage and family therapist, so she's coming from her experience working with people who are already committed to each other in some way. Yeah, so it's not really addressing the dating questions around like how do you figure out who might be a good match.
Yeah, it's just interesting, and especially since attachment styles, the idea is that they develop in your very early life. it just leads me to so many questions about how people parent their infants and how much of it is your primary caregiver and how much of it is other social and relational factors throughout your development, right? Because if it is heavily gendered, then it would be interesting to see, do men with any level of insecure attachment tend to receive the same type of treatment or expected to behave in similar ways from birth onward? And is that how they end up here, right?
You're saying, are we gendering infants and toddlers?
Yeah, and I'll go on record and say I think the research is out that we are.
Yeah.
Even those of us who are as well-intentioned as possible, that we start gendering small humans pre-birth.
Yeah.
Which is a whole other topic. But I'm interested in kind of the idea that why do most avoidants end up being men and most anxious end up being women? It's fascinating to me.
I always want to really resist those gender categories, because we have found in other neuroscience studies that when we start with the question of are you a man or a woman, then we end up with conclusions that tell us that women's brains are different from men's brains. But if we start with a different question, then we find a lot of overlap between men's brains and women's brains.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you ask for the gender binary out the gate, you get the results that follow that, which is...
You get binary results.
Yeah. It's fascinating.
Another thing about dating and attachment style theory is I just wonder if it's even possible to really game the system in this way. I think I totally get the desire to do that and to categorize people into prospect or not prospect. That would be intense. But as we were just talking about earlier with attachment styles, they are dynamic and they're different with every relationship potentially. Attachment styles might show up differently. Is it even possible to identify someone on a first date or early in a relationship, someone's attachment style and how they may or may not be compatible?
Yeah, I love that you said that. And there's a couple of thoughts that I have to that, which is your attachment style, maybe there's common internal experiences and maybe common ways of dealing with conflict, but your attachment style doesn't dictate your behavior at 100% rate. Like, you are still in control of your behavior. So just because someone has an avoidant attachment or are more slanting towards anxious does not mean that their behavior is out of control and they're just a robot punching buttons and they react. So I think that's important to honor. And then I also think that it's super important to honor that a lot of what we're talking about is and insecure attachments develop from, and I'm going to use the word trauma, which I know can be challenging for people and especially for caregivers. In this context, we're talking about relational trauma, not necessarily physical or sexual trauma or any abuse. The idea that you can't heal trauma and move towards a more secure attachment style is not validated by research. People can and do heal things and move throughout their lifetime, and that impacts how you relate to people and how you experience connection of all types. So I think it's really important not to, I think you said, take what works and leave the rest earlier. That is the key for all of this, is you don't have to struggle with the same pattern that's out of your control until the end of time, right?
This is not some static character trait that you are now stuck with for the rest of your life.
For sure.
This is something that can change.
It's something that can change, and it also presents differently in different relationships. The other thing that is important for me to process, and this is just something I've experienced when I'm researching this, is that the word anxiety is like a loaded word, because it doesn't necessarily mean like anxiety about external things. It's really talking about your anxiety in terms of how you relate to other people, right? So it's not the bus was late this morning and I'm super anxious about my presentation at work. It's really talking about the anxiety that at your core you're not lovable, which is a really different idea than like a cerebral anxiety. Now, people might become insecure and anxious and think about it, but it's definitely more primal and subconscious. So
that word gets used a lot.
It does.
Yeah.
And it also can feel a little shamey. If the person just treated their anxiety, everything would be better. But it's not like
Take
clinical
some pills.
anxiety. Yeah. It doesn't mean you've got generalized anxiety disorder. It could just mean you don't feel really secure in a relationship. One thing that I feel directly relates to sexuality that was really jumping out at me when I was researching this is that I love a good flowchart or algorithm.
Woo!
And I'm sorry to our readers, they can't see it, but there's this algorithm that just talks about the attachment behaviors that get initiated when there's separation or distress or anxiety. And this infographic is about back to young people, infants, and their primary caregivers. But it's just the path of basically, is the caregiver attentive and responsive to the child's needs? And if the answer is no, then they end up in kind of this infinite loop of seeking out that reassurance. So they're always going back to need that reassurance. And then if the caregiver is nearby and is attentive and there is a secure connection, the end of that flowchart is another loop that has playful, less inhibited, smiling, and sociable. And I cannot hear the words playful and inhibited without having a direct tie to sexuality. Because I think those are such profound and like joyful words. And I definitely believe that a key element for a lot of people in sexuality is uninhibited, connected, joyful, playful. So I just find it fascinating that those are like the two loops, right? There's the constantly needing reassurance in a feedback loop. And then there's you're getting the security and reassurance, and then you can be playful and less inhibited.
I love that. I love that on so many levels, right? We talk about how people are sexual beings throughout their lives. This is a belief that Cari and I share.
Yes.
And this is one way of expressing that is because we relate to people throughout our lives and we relate to each other physically throughout our lives. And whether it's an infant and a caregiver or whether it's a so-called romantic encounter, there are important things that are shared.
Yeah.
So you are describing here, this flowchart has some physical behaviors that might indicate different, or that might come up as a way of indicating someone's internal state.
Yeah.
And you can definitely, it doesn't seem like a big jump to me to picture this in the bedroom, so to speak.
Yeah, I agree. And I didn't seek out too much research about attachment theory and like actual acts of sex, but I certainly feel like we talk a lot about this when we're educating young people with like holistic lifespan sexuality education, as we talk about communication and trust and security and respect. And those are the foundational like values that we're often challenging young people to reach for, and they are typically the underpinnings of good sex, right? Good connected sex is secure and is from a foundation of both personal security, physical security, and all the things.
And what does it take to be playful? The same thing.
Yeah. You're not going to feel super playful if you're like in a primal feedback loop of I'm not safe. Right? That's not a joyful way to experience the world most of the time.
So this could all take place in a single sexual encounter, but it's also not about the specific behaviors, right? It's about the emotional state as you are in whatever behaviors you're doing with folks. Are you experiencing distress and anxiety? that's something to address, right? Or are you feeling secure and confident?
Yeah.
To circle back to parenting, to go full circle, attachment style begins with that infant caregiver relationship. And we do want to speak to those parents as well as to adults as parents as well as adults as romantic partners. What can this tell us about parenting? I know I read the attachment parenting books when I had the little ones, and gosh, there can be a lot of guilt there.
So much guilt, and I did ascribe and would say that I fall towards the attachment style of parenting in general, but I can remember when my now 13-year-old, just to date this because I'm not sure, since I don't have an infant anymore, I don't know how prevalent attachment parenting is in mom and dad circles, but it was all the rage 13 years ago. And there were people that were really severe about it to the point where the expectation I felt that was placed on me as a mom was physically impossible.
Ooh.
I don't even mean emotionally. I just mean like it was physically impossible for me to eat enough, sleep enough, and do the things that I needed to live in the world as a human and meet every single one of my child's needs in the ideal attachment style way. I had an infant when I nursed who wanted a lot of physical contact, and I was touched out a lot. I sometimes prioritized my own mental health or a snack over having her be fully skin on skin attached to me, right? There were times where I didn't baby wear it. I didn't do the thing. So I think it's important to note that often the research looks at when things have gone, quote, wrong, but we don't really, it's not an exact science of saying this is the temperament of the infant you got and this is your temperament as a mom. And if you do these 10 things, you get a gold star.
You want to be the best parent you can. And so there's that desire to really, check all the boxes and do all of the things, all of the sleeping together and the making your own food and
all the things.
Yeah, but
wrap them in your Moby wrap and never set them down, and just so much there. You put it really well to say that I forget how you said it, but that it can, when it gets to the point where it's overwhelming you, then that's really a sign that you need some more time for yourself somehow. Yeah, and I also think there's environmental things that go on. Not every moment of your life as a parent, you have all the supports and resources in place that would allow you to be the most actualized, fully supported version of parent as you might like to be. So I think it's really important that when we talk about like relational trauma and attachment parenting, it's not talking about failures of parenting, and it's also not really talking about what is definitively abuse, right? Most of us are doing the best we can with what we have when we have it. And there isn't a magical line of what, causes an avoidant attachment or causes an anxious attachment style. There's a lot more. There's nuance to it. No mom or dad guilting in this podcast.
Giving space to ourselves and others to be kind to yourself.
For sure.
Yeah. Hey, Cari, how did we get inspired to do this topic at this time? Would you like to get us into that?
Yeah, I love this. It'll give some maybe personal insight to anyone listening about who we are as people and what brings us to this work. And also maybe shed some light on our previous episode if there was any responses or reactions that our listeners had, or if you could hear anything in me. So our last episode where we were talking about sexual scripts, I ended up in a place where I was triggered with a capital T. I was having huge feelings, both about my personal pain and harm associated with narratives and social scripts about sexuality, And then also in not knowing how to tell Nina, like when we were recording, and I got to a place of full-on trauma trigger where I was not able to even articulate what I was upset about.
Yeah.
And do you want to share your experience of what was happening? Or for you, or your perception of me, either?
First of all, I did not realize what was happening for a good long while. I just kept going even after the recording had stopped. We continued the conversation a little bit, and I was just, without knowing it, just pushing Cari's buttons even further into this terrible place that she had gotten. And then finally, I realized that something bad had happened. And so then I froze up. And it was just... Once we got past the part, we realized that we were both responding in very typical ways in some ways, as that might illustrate patterns in relationships in general. For me, it was very avoidant in the sense of not being emotionally dialed in and very cognitive. Right?
Yeah.
And just pursuing some ideas or concepts in this very abstract way that treats them like puzzles and really disconnects them from real life experiences and feelings.
And folks, I was in my feelings and my real life experiences in a way that I was not even able to bring them back to an abstract concept. And I think what got us to this place of doing attachment theory is that when we unpacked what the conflict was, even though it's painful for me, the reality is we were responding in somewhat common ways to really taboo or difficult big topics like sexuality in like super normal human ways. Like, Nina, I don't know. We are friends in real life, but I'll say that I find you to be compassionate and empathetic and caring. Aww. So I wouldn't say that it's the norm that I find you to be like super interested in theory over the human in front of you. Like, that's not who you are in the world. And I try not to be so reactive that I'm like fully shut down. But in point of fact, you on that topic felt pretty intellectual about it. And I felt like intensely emotional about it. So I was having big reaction and you were like pretty like neutral.
La-di-da.
And I just think it's super emblematic of how a lot of the time like wires do get crossed when we're talking about loaded topics like sexuality, because those are two like super common ways to deal with difficult or scary subjects. One is the big emotional reaction where I'm in it, and then it's also common to be like, I'm going to make this super cerebral and it doesn't relate to me at all. Yeah. And they're both valid.
Very understandable. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also like a real conflict that comes out of them that needs to be addressed and needs repair. Yeah. And that is part of living and being in this world with other people.
It is. And I will go on record and say that it is a motivating factor for me to do this work, is that I think things get easier when they are dragged out into the light and discussed in a connected, social way. And so I think there's value in like moving through the conflict, even when it's very difficult. Like even when my own experience is really hard. So I hope that provides context. And I do hope that this topic is a starting point for people to maybe unpack what they're bringing to the table and if it's working for them or not.
I hope that's a really good example of how this can play out and the importance of acknowledging conflict and repair rather than avoiding conflict.
For sure. Yeah. And I think it applies with your partners, sexual partners, romantic partners. 100% know that it applies to my relationship with my daughter and in parenting. Mm-hmm. That repair and realizing I've either not dialed in or my reaction has overtaken the whole topic is a huge part of what I feel parenting a teen is right now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
When we are all works in progress.
Yes, we are.
Yeah. Always. Great. I'm glad to be doing this with you, Cari.
Me too, Nina. And now we know a little bit more about each other, and I think it's exciting.
It'll be good.
Thanks for spending time with us today. Don't forget, we would like to hear from you. What did you think of today's episode? What questions or thoughts do you have about sex and sexuality? We will share some questions and replies in a future episode. Please write to us at gasppod@gmail.com. That's GASPPOD@gmail.com.
And thanks also to our sponsor, Oak Park Our Whole Lives. Oak Park OWL delivers comprehensive, inclusive sexuality education to youth and families in the greater west side of the Chicagoland area. For more information, check out their website at www.opowl.org.
Take care of yourself and others. Talk to you soon.